400 planes rose into the Pacific sky. By sunset, almost all were gone. No warning, no mercy. On June 19, 1944, America didn't just win a battle, it erased Japan's air power in a single day. This is the moment the sky changed forever. The Pacific was still asleep when the engines began to growl. Before sunrise on June 19, 1944, Task Force 58 floated in near silence, 15 American carriers cutting through dark water, their decks alive with shadows in steel. The air smelled of fuel salt and something harder to name expectation. This was no routine patrol. Intelligence was clear. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan was assembling the largest carrier strike of the war. Hundreds of aircraft. One final gamble to break the American fleet. On the flight deck of USS Independence, Lieutenant Commander David Harrington strapped himself into his Hellcat. He had flown combat before. He had survived when others hadn't. But this felt different. The machine beneath him was heavier, stronger, built to endure what earlier fighters never could. 6.50 caliber guns rested in its wings. 2,000 horsepower waited at his command. As dawn bled orange across the horizon, engines roared to life one by one, deck crews scattered, catapults locked in. Harrington looked out over the endless calm of the sea and understood the truth every pilot felt in his bones. The stillness was a lie. In a few hours, the Pacific sky would be filled with fire, and history would break apart above it. Only 3 years earlier, a morning like this would have ended very differently. In December 1941, the sky had belonged to Japan. At Pearl Harbor, American sailors looked up and saw sleek fighters cutting through the clouds like ghosts. The Zero was fast, light, impossibly agile. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and struck first. To the men facing it, the Zero didn't feel like a plane. It felt like fate. Across the Pacific Wake Island, the Philippines, the Coral Sea. The story repeated itself. Young American pilots climbed into underpowered fighters and were thrown against an enemy they could barely touch. Dogfights became executions. Turning meant death. Climbing meant death. Even escape felt like a miracle. David Harrington remembered those days clearly. His first combat tour had been flown in a stubby Wildcat that shook under full throttle. Against the Zero, every maneuver felt like a gamble with loaded dice. You dove, you fired, and you prayed the Zero didn't follow. Many didn't make it back. Machines were lost, but worse men were lost. Boys with weeks of training vanished into the sea. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Courage alone would not win this war. So America adapted. Engineers listened to survivors. Every weakness of the Zero was cataloged. Every mistake paid for in blood was written into steel. The result was not elegance, not agility, but power, armor, firepower, survival. The Hellcat was born not to dance, but to fight. And as Harrington sat on that carrier deck in the fading darkness of June 19th, he knew something the enemy did not. The age of the Zero was already ending. The Hellcat was not born from confidence. It was born from fear, failure, and funerals. By mid-1942, America understood the truth it could no longer ignore. The Zero could not be beaten by bravery alone. So the engineers at Grumman stopped chasing elegance. They stopped trying to outturn the enemy. Instead, they asked one question: how do we bring our pilots home alive? The answer came in steel. The Hellcat was heavy where the Zero was light. It wore armor where the Zero trusted luck. Self-sealing fuel tanks replaced fragile skin. A massive engine delivered raw, unforgiving power. 6.50 caliber machine guns waited in the wings, built not for warning shots, but for destruction. This was not a dancer. It was a brawler. When the first Hellcats reached the fleet in late 1943, pilots felt the difference immediately. The Wildcat had always felt like a compromise. The Hellcat felt like permission to climb higher, dive faster, hit harder, and live through it. You could make a mistake and survive. You could take hits and keep flying. Even a newly trained pilot could handle it without fear. But the machine was only half the story. Behind every Hellcat stood something Japan could no longer match. American factories poured them out by the thousands. Flight schools ran day and night, while Japanese pilots entered combat with 50 hours in the cockpit. Americans arrived with hundreds. While Japan guarded every veteran like a relic, America replaced losses without slowing down. The math was ruthless, and by 1944, it was irreversible. As Harrington looked across the flight deck that morning, rows of Hellcats gleaming under the rising sun, he understood what the Zero pilots did not. This war had changed, and in the skies above the Marianas, the reckoning was about to begin. By the summer of 1944, everything pointed toward one place: the Marianas, tiny islands scattered across the Pacific, barely visible on most maps, but priceless to both sides. From their airfields, American bombers could finally reach Japan itself. For Tokyo, losing them meant the war would come home. For the United States, taking them meant the endgame had begun. So both sides committed everything. Admiral Spruance and Admiral Mitcher assembled Task Force 58 into the greatest carrier force the world had ever seen. 15 fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, most of them Hellcats. It was not a fleet, it was a moving wall of steel. Across the sea, Admiral Ozawa gathered Japan's remaining strength. 9 carriers, around 400 aircraft. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was a gamble born of desperation. Many of his pilots were not veterans of Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea. They were replacements. Boys rushed through shortened training programs, sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time. But they carried the same orders: break the American fleet or die trying. On the night of June 18th, Harrington walked the flight deck beneath a moonlit sky. The air reeked of gasoline and salt spray. His Hellcat sat silent, wings, folded tail number painted clean and bright. He ran a hand across its riveted skin, feeling the cold certainty of the metal. This was not 1942. This was not a fair fight. Below decks, radar operators watched green blips flicker to life. Contacts appeared, then multiplied. Dozens, scores, hundreds. Somewhere far to the west, Japanese aircraft were already climbing into the darkness, forming wave after wave for one final strike. By dawn, there would be no turning back. As the first light crept over the horizon, Harrington climbed into his cockpit and tightened his straps. Around him, engines began to roar. Deck crews scattered. Catapults locked. The trap was set. And when the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, the sky itself prepared to choose a side. Dawn on June 19th did not arrive quietly. It came alive with motion, noise, and urgency. Flight decks erupted as engines roared to full power. Mechanics shouted, Ordnance crews hauled ammunition. The calm of the Pacific shattered beneath the thunder of American carriers launching wave after wave of fighters into the morning sky. Inside the Combat Information Center, radar screens glowed. Blips appeared on the edges, then rushed inward. Not dozens, not even scores. Hundreds, multiple contacts. Bearing west, massive formation. The words hit like a punch to the chest. This was it. Japan had thrown everything into the air. On the deck of Independence, David Harrington dropped into his cockpit and locked the canopy. The world outside narrowed to gauge his vibrations and the steady growl of 2,000 horses pulling against their restraints. Ahead of him, Hellcats vanished one by one, off the bow, flung into open sky. When his turn came, the catapult slammed him forward with brutal force. Steel dropped away. The ocean fell beneath him. Then freedom, raw, violent, exhilarating. Harrington climbed hard, his wingman sliding into place. Below them, Task Force 58 spread across the sea like a fortress. Above them, the sky darkened. At 15,000 feet, they saw it. A black wall stretching across the horizon. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, red insignia flashing in the sunlight. The largest aerial armada Japan would ever launch. The radio crackled with calm, practiced voices. Orders were short, precise. No panic. Intercept. Hold altitude. Do not let them through. Harrington tightened his grip on the stick. He felt no fear now, only focus. The Hellcat vibrated with restrained violence, eager to dive. This was no longer a test of survival. This was a test of supremacy. As the first Japanese wave surged forward, the distance between the two forces collapsed in seconds. Sunlight glinted off wings. Tracers flashed. And then the sky caught fire. Altitude was life, and the Hellcats had it. From high above the Japanese formation, Harrington rolled his fighter onto its back and pushed the nose down. The world tilted. Gravity grabbed hold. The Hellcat screamed as it dove, speed building fast, the airframe shuddering with controlled violence. Below him, the enemy was exposed. Zeros twisted upward, trying to climb and meet the attack, but they were already too late. The Americans came out of the sun like falling steel. Harrington lined up his target, a Zero climbing hard, its pilot unaware. At 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 50 caliber guns erupted. The tracers tore through the Zero's thin skin. The cockpit flashed. Fire bloomed. In less than a second, the aircraft disintegrated into smoke and fragments vanishing into the sea below. Splash 1. Harrington pulled back hard, climbing away before the enemy could react. Around him, the sky exploded into chaos. Hellcats slashed through formations, striking once, then vanishing upward again. Bombers fell burning. Torpedo planes disintegrated before they could even line up an attack. The Japanese tried to fight back. Zeros clawed upward, desperate to force turning battles. But every time they tried, the Hellcats refused the dance. They climbed, and came back again, relentless, disciplined, deadly. A call crackled over the radio. His wingman was in trouble. Harrington rolled over Dove again and fired into a Zero, riding his partner's tail. The enemy fighter exploded midair. The second broke off and fled. Below them, the ocean became a graveyard. Burning wreckage punched into the water. Parachutes blossomed and drifted among oil slicks already on fire. By 10:30 a.m., it was over. The first Japanese wave had been shattered. Dozens of aircraft lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Fewer than 10 had reached the American fleet, and none survived the wall of anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. But the radios were already lighting up again. New contacts, larger formation inbound. Harrington checked his fuel, his ammo. Then he looked west. The sky was darkening again. Japan was coming back for more. The western sky filled again, thicker, this time heavier. The second wave came in like a tide that refused to retreat. Over 100 Japanese aircraft surged forward, fighters weaving above dive bombers and torpedo planes, dragging their loads toward the fleet. For a brief moment, the sheer size of it felt overwhelming. It looked endless, like an entire air force thrown into the sky at once. Harrington tightened his jaw. "This is round 2, his wingman said, voice tight with adrenaline. Harrington answered calmly. "Then we finish it." The Hellcats dove. 36 blue fighters tore through the sunlight, guns flashing, engines howling. The Japanese formation cracked almost immediately. Inexperienced pilots broke rank. Bombers scattered. Veterans tried to hold discipline, tried to build a shield, but the Hellcats smashed through it like a hammer through glass. Harrington picked out a Val dive bomber, its bomb swinging beneath the fuselage. One short burst. The engine erupted. The bomb detonated midair, shredding metal and fire across the sky. Splash 1. 0 swarmed in response. 1 latched onto Harrington's tail tracer, stitching across his wing. The Hellcat shuddered. Harrington didn't turn, he dove. The 0 followed, too eager, too close. At 5,000 feet, Harrington pulled straight up. The Hellcat clawed skyward. The 0 stalled. That was the moment. Harrington rolled over, dropped back down, and fired. The 0 exploded into flame. Everywhere the same scene played out. Torpedo bombers were slaughtered before they could line up a run. Dive bombers fell burning. Zeros twisted desperately, fighting ghosts they could no longer catch. Captain Green's squadron tore into the torpedo planes, the same type that had ravaged Pearl Harbor. This time, they barely reached the fleet. They died in streaks of smoke and fire. By noon, the sky was choking with wreckage. And still, the radios crackled. New contacts inbound. Third wave. Harrington looked west again. Japan was throwing everything it had left into the fire. And the fire was hungry. The third wave arrived broken before it even reached the fight. These weren't the elite pilots of earlier years. They were young, rushed, barely trained. Some struggled to hold formation as they pushed east engines, straining fear, hiding behind duty. And yet they came because there was nothing else left to send. Fresh Hellcats climbed to meet them as others peeled away to refuel. The rotation was seamless, merciless. Where one American squadron left the sky, another replaced it within minutes. For the Japanese, there was no relief, no pause, only the growing certainty that they were flying into a machine that could not be stopped. Harrington dove again. A Judy bomber filled his gun sight. One squeeze of the trigger tore its engine apart. The pilot bailed out parachute, snapping open, drifting helplessly toward a sea already burning with fuel and wreckage. Harrington pulled up hard, scanning for the next target. Splash. Another one down. They're falling apart. The radio was alive with voices, calm, almost clinical. Below them, the ocean told a different story. Smoke columns clawed upward. Aircraft hit the water and vanished in walls of flame. Parachutes dotted the surface like scattered confessions. Zeros tried one last time to force turning fights. They clawed upward, bled speed, stalled, and died. The Hellcat's power was unforgiving. It climbed where the Zero could not. It dove where the Zero could not escape. At 1:15 p.m. radar picked up a fourth wave. Smaller, slower. These weren't squadrons. They were scraps training planes, outdated machines, anything that could still lift off a deck. It was desperation given wings. Finish it, came the order. It didn't take long. The fourth wave barely reached American airspace before it disintegrated. Twin-engine bombers lumbered forward and were torn apart in seconds. Fighters burned. The sky cleared, then silence. Harrington leveled out at 12,000 feet. The horizon was empty. No swarms, no shadows. Only smoke drifting where an air force had existed hours earlier. The Philippine Sea had become a graveyard, and Japan's wings were gone. The silence was unsettling. After hours of constant motion engines, screaming guns, hammering radios alive with voices, the sky suddenly felt empty. Harrington scanned the horizon again and again. Nothing. No black clouds of aircraft. No red insignia flashing in the sun. Just drifting smoke and the distant glint of fire on the water below. The battle was over. Below him, the Philippine Sea told the story in full. Burning oil slicks stretched for miles. Broken wings floated among twisted fuselages. Life rafts bobbed helplessly in the wreckage, surrounded by debris where pilots had vanished moments earlier. What had been Japan's carrier air arm that morning was now scattered across the ocean floor. By mid-afternoon, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Veteran pilots irreplaceable gone in a single day. In return, American losses barely reached 30. It wasn't just a victory. It was a collapse so complete that history would struggle to find a comparison. Harrington felt it settle in his chest as he circled above the fleet. This wasn't just another mission survived. This was the breaking point. The moment when the Zero, the aircraft that had once ruled the Pacific, finally died. He throttled back and turned toward Task Force 58. Fuel was low, ammunition nearly gone. His hands trembled now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. The carrier decks below came into view calm again, almost ordinary, like they hadn't just witnessed the destruction of an entire air force. Independence, this is Harrington, returning to base. The reply came steady, almost casual. Copy, you're cleared to land. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck, the arresting wire snapping tight. When the engine cut, Harrington sat motionless in the cockpit, breathing hard, alive. Around him, other pilots climbed out, grinning, shaken, exhausted. The smell of cordite clung to their flight suits. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, already preparing for whatever came next. But everyone there understood the truth. On June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation had not been beaten. It had been erased. The celebration came quietly. That night aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, laughter echoed across the mess decks. Pilots traded stories, hands slicing the air as they replayed dives, bursts, explosions. Some grinned wide. Others stared into their coffee eyes distant. Victory had a sound, but it also had a weight. Captain Green stood before them later, his voice steady, unflinching. "Gentlemen," he said, "today, we destroyed Japanese carrier aviation. Not weakened it, destroyed it." The numbers followed. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft gone. Less than 30 American losses. The room fell silent. Numbers had a way of stripping emotion bare. Harrington stepped out onto the deck alone. The Pacific stretched endlessly under the stars, oil fires still burning faintly on the horizon. Somewhere out there, young Japanese pilots drifted in the dark, clinging to wreckage, believing until the last moment that they could change the course of the war. The victory didn't feel sweet. He thought back to 1942, to Wildcats shaking under full throttle, to Zeros twisting like knives through the sky, to the helplessness. That world was gone now. In its place stood something colder, more final. Japan hadn't just lost planes that day. It had lost what could never be replaced. Experience mastery, the men who had once made the Zero a legend. From now on, replacements would be boys with rush training flying obsolete machines into a sky owned by Hellcats. America, meanwhile, would keep coming. More pilots, more carriers, more aircraft rolling off factory lines without pause. Harrington rested his hands on the cold steel rail and whispered the truth no one needed to say aloud. We broke them today. June 19, 1944 was not the end of the war, but it was the end of an era. From that day forward, the Pacific sky belonged to America, and it would never be given back. Morning returned to the Pacific without ceremony. The sea was calm. The sky was empty. No swarms of fighters. No rising columns of smoke clawing upward. Task Force 58 steamed west in steady formation decks. Quiet now, Hellcats lined up with wings folded like sentinels who had already done their duty. But history had shifted. On June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as a fighting force. Not gradually, not over months. In a single day, decades of training experience and hard-won skill vanished into the Philippine Sea. Nearly 400 aircraft destroyed. The veteran pilots who had once terrorized Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Coral Sea were gone, lost in hours never to be replaced. From that moment on, the Zero was no longer feared. Its legend burned away in smoke and wreckage. The myth that had dominated the Pacific died under the guns of the Hellcat. What replaced it was something far more powerful: control. American carriers would now sail where they wished, strike when they wished. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each advance carried under a sky guarded by Hellcats. 3 months later, Tokyo itself would tremble beneath American bombs. And when the war finally ended, Hellcats would circle above Tokyo Bay, watching over the surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The Hellcat was not magic. It was not invincible. What it represented was far more important. Proof that adaptation could defeat myth, that training could defeat talent, that industry could defeat heroism when heroism stood alone. For Harrington, the memory never faded. Not the roar of the engine, not the flash of tracers, not the sight of young enemy pilots falling into the sea. He remembered the sunset that evening, red light washing over steel decks and folded wings, and the understanding that war had changed forever. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a victory. It was the moment the sky itself chose a side, and it never chose again. The world would remember the numbers. Historians always do. Kill ratios, production totals, aircraft lost versus aircraft built. By the end of the war, the Hellcat would account for more than 5,000 enemy planes destroyed. A kill ratio so lopsided, it would seem impossible until you understood what June 19th had proven. This was no longer a war of aces. It was a war of systems. Japan had built legends, brilliant pilots, unmatched skill machines balanced on perfection. But legends are fragile. They cannot be replaced. When they fall forever. On that day over the Philippine Sea, Japan lost more than aircraft. It lost time. It lost experience. It lost the men who knew how to win. America had built something else. Factories that never slept. Training programs that turned civilians into professionals. Aircraft designed not to impress, but to survive. The Hellcat did not promise glory. It promised that its pilot might come home alive. And that promise changed everything. David Harrington understood that truth standing on the deck at sunset, watching the Pacific glow red beneath folded wings. The men around him laughed, joked, lived. Victory surrounded them in steel and sound, but beneath it all was a quiet certainty. The future of war had arrived. From that moment on, courage alone would never be enough. Skill alone would never be enough. Wars would be won by nations that could learn faster, build faster, train deeper, and endure longer than their enemies. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just the end of Japanese naval aviation. It was a warning to every nation that believed myth could defeat preparation, to every commander who trusted tradition over adaptation, to every pilot who thought the sky belonged to him forever. On June 19, 1944, the sky delivered its verdict. Not to the brave, not to the legendary, but to the side that had learned how to fight the future, and the future had arrived on Hellcat wings.